So I'll be speaking to you today about the Jewish German philosopher Martin Buber. And as in the course of this video, I'll begin with a short biography of Buber, and then I'll move into his various key ideas, especially the idea of the I-you relation, and the way in which the I-you relation differs from the I-it. And what does it mean to relate to another human being as a you rather than as an it? And can this apply to relating to other elements of the natural world? What would it mean to relate to a tree as a you rather than an it? And how does Buber's distinction between I-you and I-it relate to the history of philosophy? Has philosophy tended to turn conceptions of human beings and the world and of God into it forms rather than you forms? We'll also see how Buber's idea of I-it and I-you apply to his social and political thought, and his reflections on utopian socialism, on binationalism, and on the kingship of God. And we'll then consider Buber's notion of God as the eternal you. As he describes it, God is a you who can never become an it. And we'll look at the implications of this idea for the writing of theology, as well as for biblical interpretation. Now, but before we get into the deeper ideas, I first want to give a bit of a taster of Buber's thought in his own words, because for Buber especially, it's not only what he says, but how he says it that has implications for how we understand him. So I'll give you just the opening passage here of I and Thou, his most famous book, and we'll then go on to the rest of the discussion. So, the world is twofold for man in accordance with his twofold attitude. The attitude of man is twofold in accordance with the two basic words he can speak. The basic words are not single words, but word pairs. One basic word is the word pair, I-you. The other basic word is the word pair, I-it. But this basic word is not changed when he or she takes the place of it. Thus, the I of man is twofold. For the I of the basic word, I-you, is different from that in the basic word, I-it. Basic words do not state something that might exist outside them. By being spoken, they establish a mode of existence. Basic words are spoken with one's being. When one says you, the I of the word pair, I-you, is said too. When one says it, the I of the word pair, I-it, is said too. The basic word, I-you, can only be spoken with one's whole being. The basic word, I-it, can never be spoken with one's whole being. So, in terms of a brief biography of Buber, he was born in 1878 in Vienna, but he grew up in Austrian Galicia, in the city of Lemberg or Lviv, with his grandparents in a traditionally religious Jewish household. So he had those elements of traditional Judaism growing up, but also moved away from them in his teenage years. At age 14, he became an enthusiast of Nietzsche, and at age 17, he started a translation of Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra into Polish, which would have been the first Polish translation of that text, although Buber only completed part of it and it was never published at that time. But we can see then he has both traditional religious as well as radical philosophical elements informing his background. And in his mature years, he became a prominent figure in the German cultural and intellectual scene, became a popular writer in Germany, writing about various aspects of Judaism, lectured in various cities around the German-speaking Central European context, and then with his book I and Thou, or Ich und Du, published in 1923, he gained a very wide readership in the general public and interacted with various other German intellectuals. And this book had a particularly notable influence on Christian theologians of his time, including Karl Barth, Emil Brunner, Paul Tillich, and in the American context, Reinhold Niebuhr. In addition, he founded the journal Der Jude in 1916 and edited it until 1924, and this journal became one of the most prominent sources of cultural reflection, intellectual thought, political and social analysis on Jewish themes and topics in Europe at its time. He also engaged in a prominent retranslation of the Hebrew Bible into German with the thinker Franz Rosenzweig. And Buber and Rosenzweig sought to find ways of making the biblical ideas new and strange again to their audiences, and even shocking, in an attempt to break contemporary modern audiences out of their more blasé approach to the biblical text. During this same time period, he became a lecturer at the University of Frankfurt, where he served from 1924 until 1933, when he was forced to resign after the Nazi seizure of power. Subsequent to this, he became the head of the Freies Jüdisches Lehrhaus, originally founded by Rosenzweig in Frankfurt, and it was a center of Jewish adult education that Buber led and expanded during the Nazi years in Germany. Subsequently, though, he was forced to flee Germany for Palestine in 1938, where he then took up the post as professor of social philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So that was in 1938, and he served in that role until his retirement in 1951, when he continued, though, to remain prominent in cultural and intellectual scenes in the State of Israel until his death in 1965. Now, in order to understand what became Buber's most well-known idea, the idea of the I-U relation, it's important to recognize that in his earlier thought, his thought took a much more mystical bent, and he was very much interested in the notion of mystical union, the idea of overcoming the divide between self and other, in many cases in the history of mysticism, overcoming the divide between the self and the divine other. And in this way, with the elimination of the self-other distinction, this mode of mystical relation was also seen in philosophical terms as overcoming the subject-object division. Now, when he moved later to what's been called his dialogical phase, this development of the I-U relation, rather than seeing relationship as overcoming the distinction between self and other, he proposed the notion of I-U relation as an alternative to subject-object relation, yet as not eliminating the distinction between self and other, but of affirming both the self and the other in relation to one another. So in this sense, rather than a subject-object divide, we could describe it as a subject-subject relation. The self, the I, relates to the other as an equal self, that upholding both parties in the relationship in their uniqueness, rather than one party standing in a dominating relation or controlling relation to the other. So this is his notion of the I-U relation, which, unlike his previous idea of mystical union, it does constitute a certain type of unification. The I enters into relation with the U, but at the same time it upholds both parties in their uniqueness and singularity without dissolving the distinction between them. And just as an analogy, one could compare this to the notion of marital union. In a marriage, you have two individuals who relate to one another, not by dissolving the distinction between them, but precisely the marriage is constituted by each individual upholding his or her uniqueness, and yet coming together in a form of unification that is greater than either of the two individuals taken alone. So in this sense, the notion of I-U retains an idea of duality of the I and the U, but it's a duality that's then contained in a broader relationship of union, but one that differs from mystical union. Now, as we heard from the opening lines that I read out earlier, a key theme in Buber's notion of I and U is that the human being is constituted by two potential different modes of being in the world: the mode or orientation of I-U and the mode and orientation of I-it. And as he says, the I of the I-U is different from the I of the I-it. If we take the I-it first, the I-it relation is a relation of manipulation, of control, of use, of utilization, of exploitation of another object, or of another person as an object. So it's to treat someone as a thing. In this sense, I, as the subject, would have control over something or someone as an object. It's an object for my use. By contrast, the relation of I-you is a relation of respect and mutuality or affirmation. It's an openness to hear the other, hear what the other has to say or to bring, as someone unique and different from me, not merely as something that I know or control. And we can see already in Buber's notion, the idea of I, you, and I, it has a familiarity to us if we just think about the way in which the terms you or it are used in broader everyday language and grammar. For instance, in English, we describe a person as a you, but we usually would not describe, say, a chair or a stone as a you. And conversely, while we might describe a chair or a stone in terms of it, we usually would not want to describe another person as an it. And we can even hear, just if we take, say, the same sentence, say, I will chop it into pieces. That doesn't necessarily sound so problematic if we have a log of firewood. If I'm going to chop it into pieces for my use, that doesn't necessarily seem like a major problem. But if we took that same sentence and said, I'm going to chop you into pieces, it starts to sound a bit more problematic. So already just in the basic everyday use of it as opposed to you, we can get a sense of these two modes of being in the world. Now, what's crucial, though, is that even in regard to human relations, sometimes the spoken word you can be used even when the person is engaging with an attitude of I, it. So if we take the example, say, if I say to